Since the release of the Golden Tee XL cabinet by Arcade1Up, one major issue that some customers have complained about is the quality of the 19-inch LCD panel. The LCD panel looks fine when standing in front of the cabinet, but when sitting down or viewing to the side, the image would become washed out in places. For some, the stock LCD panel is just fine, but for others, the washout is unbearable. On May 26, 2022, I posted a video on how to replace the Arcade1Up Golden Tee XL stock monitor with an IPS LCD panel from a Dell P1917S monitor. I picked up the Dell P1917S for about $50, and there's a stark difference with the quality of the picture. With the help of the retro gaming community, word has been spreading about this modification. But a question I see asked by some is, can this work with other LCD panels pulled from other monitors? There are some people that have 19-inch monitors sitting at home or can obtain one for free somewhere. Well, the answer is yes. If you have a monitor that is 19-inch and is 1280 by 1024, the LCD panel you pull from the monitor should work. Now, I say should work as there is no way I can confirm with 100% certainty that every LCD panel will work. It is possible that there could be distortion on some LCD panels when plugged directly to the Arcade1Up PCB. However, in theory, if the LCD panel is 1280 by 1024, it should work on the Golden Tee XL PCB. With that said, the quality of the LCD panel you pull from the monitor may not be as good or is on par, no pun intended, with the stock Arcade1Up panel. Most monitor manufacturers use a technology called Twisted Pneumatic, or TN, for their monitors. In this chart are some differences between the two technologies. Although TN LCD panels do have some advantages to the IPS LCD panels, like smoother on-screen motion, cheaper and faster response times, the disadvantages are less color clarity and contrast and narrow viewing angles compared to IPS panels. Current iterations of IPS are catching up with TN monitors as far as response time and refresh rate, but the monitors for the Golden Tee XL upgrade are generally going to be older, and if you do not get one that is specifically IPS, it will more than likely be a TN monitor. Some current TN monitors use LED lights to produce light on the LCD panel, and these panels should be able to use the stock Arcade1Up inverter board that comes with the Golden Tee XL. Simply follow the directions as shown in the video for the IPS screen replacement, with the only difference being how you decase the monitor to get to the LCD panel, as each monitor manufacturer assembles their monitors differently. However, older monitors used a lighting system called cold cathode fluorescent lamps, or CCFL for short. CCFL backlighting has been mostly phased out of current LCD monitors, but for 19-inch monitors that are older, they more than likely have CCFL lamps in them. Because CCFL lamps differ from LED lights, you cannot use the stock Arcade1Up inverter board that is in the Golden Tee XL cabinet. However, you can still use the LCD panel with CCFL lamps. You just have to buy the correct inverter board, which costs about $10 to $15, and some extension lamp cables so you can place the inverter board on the back of the Arcade1Up wood bezel, as the inverter board would be too thick to put in the LCD panel casing like the stock Arcade1Up inverter board. There are plenty of different 19-inch monitors to choose from, but one of the better monitors, in my opinion, is the Dell 1908FPt monitor. This is a 19-inch monitor with a 1280 by 1024 LCD panel produced by LG, with model number LM190E08-TLG5. So in this video, I will be replacing the stock Arcade1Up panel with the one pulled from the P1908FPt monitor, which uses CCFL lamps. The video can be followed for most any LCD panel that uses CCFL lamps, but decasing the monitor may be different. I will show you the technical specs between the two monitors, show a video side-by-side comparison, and show video on what the monitor looks like in the XL cabinet. If by viewing the comparison videos you feel the differences in quality is worth the upgrade, I will continue with a how-to video on how to replace the stock Arcade1Up panel with the new one, including a list of parts needed to perform the upgrade. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to compare both of the LCD panels. In the left column is the Arcade 1-Up stock LCD panel from the Golden Tee XL, which is the M190ETN01.0 by AUO. And on the right is the LCD panel from the Dell 1908 monitor, which is an LG, which is model number LM190E08-TLG5. So I made this comparison on panellook.com. I just used the compare feature to bring up both of these model LCD panels and did the compare feature on it, and I hid any of the values that were the same. So the first section we're going to look at is basic information and nothing really going on here. We got the panel brand, which we already said, with the stock Arcade 1-Up being the AUO and the stock Dell being the LG Philips LCD. Now it's got some special features which I don't think is really relevant to our testing, but it's basically for the AUO, it's a WLED backlit upside IF matte, whereas the one from the Dell just says life greater than or equal to 50K hours matte. And then the remarks just basically has some compliance information, where the Dell one, which is the LG, does not have any information at all. And the next section are the mechanical features, and nothing really earth-shattering here. Just has the weight, the bezel area, and the outline depth of the panels. For the outline depth, the LG panel, which is from the Dell, is a little larger than the outline depth for the stock Arcade 1-Up, and it weighs a little bit more. The next section is the optical features, and this is when we start getting into the actual specifics of the panel that will affect the look of it as far as the image goes. So the brightness, the LG panel is a little bit brighter at 300, whereas the stock Arcade 1-Up is 250. However, the transmissive contrast ratio is higher on the stock Arcade 1-Up, which would be the AOU M model, which is 1000:1, whereas on the LG panel it's 800:1. Now for the NTSC ratio, sRGB coverage, Adobe coverage, DCI-P3 coverage, I don't know exactly what these values are and what they mean, but some of them on the AOU panel, the stock Arcade 1-Up, are a little bit higher, and some on the LG panel are a little bit higher or lower. Now, if we look at the viewing angle, which is LRUD, which is left, right, up, down, we can see that the stock Arcade 1-Up is 85, 85, 80, 80, whereas on the Dell, which is the LG, is 85, 85, 75, 85. So although the stock Arcade 1-Up on the, I'll just call it the up mode, which I guess when you're looking up on it, is 80 versus the Dell, which is 75. When you look down on it, the LG is actually 85 degrees, whereas the stock Arcade 1-Up is 80 degrees. Then we have the viewing direction, which nothing in there for the stock Arcade 1-Up, but it says 6 o'clock for the LG panel. And then finally, we look at the response time. The response time for the stock Arcade 1-Up is 3.6/1.4, whereas the Dell, which is the LG, is 1.3/3.7. Now, those numbers look like they're swapped, but they look like they both have about the same amount of response time. And then finally, you have the white variation, which I'm not sure what that is, but the stock Arcade 1-Up has 1.25 to 1.33, whereas the LG has a 1.33 max. Next, we have the electronics features, which is basically power consumption. As you can see, The LG panel, it has a whopping 25.1 watts, whereas the stock arcade 1-up is 9.4 watts, which doesn't surprise me considering that the LG panel from the Dell is about 20 years old. And so next we have the backlit system, which is pretty important here. So we have, for the lamp position, the stock arcade 1-up is edge light type, which is, it has it on the bottom side. And the same thing with the LG from the Dell is edge light type, and it has a lamp that's on the top and the bottom of the screen. The lamp type, of course, the stock arcade 1-up is WLED, which means it's got LED lights, and the LG panel from the Dell is using CCFL lamps. The lamp amount on the arcade 1-up stock is 11S4P, and all the LG panel says is it is 4-piece. The lamp life type is at 30K minimum, whereas on the stock arcade, and it's 50K for the LG panel. And then you have light voltage, lamp current, lamp operating frequency, and lamp startup voltage, which vary from each one. Lamp power consumption as well. Again, the LG is taking up more power, which for a 20-year-old LCD panel is typical. The blue position and blue interfaces. So in my previous video, I thought this was the connector. These are the connectors for where you connect the lamps to. So there's only one interface for the LCD panel, and that's where you plug in the from the inverter board to the monitor itself. Whereas if you look at the blue interface amount for the LG panel, it says 4-piece, meaning it has 4 lamp connectors. And the interface is 6-pin for the LED panel, which is the arcade 1-up stock, and then there's 2 pins for each lamp cable on the LG panel from the Dell. And then finally we have the interface pin configuration, which of course is going to be different, but all to say that the interfaces are different because one's an LED, which is the stock arcade 1-up, versus the other one, which is using CCFL lamps, which is the Dell using the LG panel. The signal interface, nothing really earth-shattering here. It's just basically talking about the LVDS connections, so the input, the power consumption from the LVDS, and the interface module and the pin configuration. Again, nothing amazing here. Just know that the same 30-pin LVDS connection we're using in the stock arcade 1-up, we're going to use for the Dell monitor that is for the LG panel that we pulled. And finally, I combined the last 3 sections, which are the packing form, data sheet source, and transaction information. The only thing of importance here is essentially the mass production date, which I said the panel was 20 years old. It looks like the last time the panel was produced was in 2008 Q2, so that would be 2018. So it's about 14 years old, this panel is. So, and it's of course discontinued because it's such an older panel. So just something thought would bring to light, maybe interesting to some, but you know, it's really not that important as far as how the panel will work in the arcade 1-up Golden Tee game. So that's pretty much it for the technical comparison. Let's go to our videos next and do a side-by-side comparison of the arcade 1-up stock LCD panel versus the one we pulled from the Dell. So the first video comparison is going to be a side-by-side comparison. to each LCD panel. And this is the hardware that I use to perform this action. So both displays that I'll have a side-by-side comparison to will be running from the same Arcade 1-Up PCB Golden Tee XL PCB. So the LVDS connection, it goes into what's called an LVDS splitter, and it inputs into that, and there are two outputs that output to the LVDS cables, which will be plugged into the monitor. The inverter board power is pretty much doing the same thing that the HDMI splitter is, where it's splitting the power from the one power source from the PCB and going and splitting the power to both of the inverter boards, which will then be plugged into each LCD panel. Now the inverter boards that I'm using are not the stock Arcade 1-Up inverter boards that come with the Golden Tee XL cabinet. So you'll notice that the two inverter boards are different that we're using, and that's because one's for an LED panel and one is for CCFL lamps. The one on the left is used for the LCD panel, which is going to be the stock Arcade 1-Up panel, and the one on the right is for the CCFL lamps, which is going to be used with the one we take out of the Dell 1908FPt model. So that's why both are different. They do operate the same, but they just have different plugs. The LED has a 6-pin plug, while the CCFL has 2-pin connections for the 4 lamps, and that's why the inverter boards look different. So with all that said, we can go ahead and begin the side-by-side comparison of both of these LCD panels. Okay, so the first video is a side-by-side comparison of both LCD panels. So on the left is the stock Arcade 1-Up panel, and on the right is the panel taken from the Dell 1908FP monitor. So as you can see, we've got both up here, and I'm going to start moving the camera and doing some extreme angles and showing you the different views of the panel. So at this point, I'm going to be quiet now, and I'm just going to let you watch, and you be the judge of how each panel looks. Okay, so for now, the next comparison test is the cabinets are actually in the Golden Tee cabinet. And we're going to start with the stock Arcade 1-Up, which is the M190ETN01.0. Now again, I've turned off the lights so that there's no glare coming on the screen. And I'm not going to say anything about, what's happening. I'm basically just going to tell you what I'm doing while I'm in the video, and it's basically I'm standing, then I'm sitting, so that you can tell when I sit, what the angle looks like, and when I walk over to the sides. So so I'm not going to give an opinion of how the video looks or anything. I'll leave that up to you and which one you think is better. But again, this is a stock arcade 1-up. So basically, I've started the game, going into one player and going into the Oak Valley. So right now I'm standing in front of the Golden Tea cabinet, and that's what it looks like. And this is what it looks like when I sit down. And this is my eye level when I'm looking at it. This is when I stand. And now I'm going over to the side, which is extreme, but just to show you the angle on the side here. And what I'm doing is I kneeled down a little bit to kind of, like I was sitting, and doing the same thing, walking over to the left side. And then I act like I'm sitting as well, bending my knees. And just coming back to the center. And sitting down again. And that's how I view it when I sit down, and this is how I view it when I stand up. So the next panel we're doing is we're putting in the Dell P1908FPt LCD panel, which is model LG LM190E08-TLG5, and this is in the arcade 1-up Golden Tea cabinet. So again, I'm not going to tell you how everything looks. I'm just going to tell you what I'm doing. So right now we're just waiting for it to come up. And of course I've got the lights turned off to avoid glare on the monitor. And now I'm going into the game. And when I go into the game here, alright, so this is my view when I'm standing up. And this is the view when I sit down. This is the view when I stand up. And this is the view when I sit down. Again, standing up. Again, sitting down. Now I'm standing up, and I'm going to go to some extreme angles. Now I didn't simulate me sitting down on the side, so I apologize for that, but this is an extreme angle right here. And then we're going to an extreme angle over here. And we're coming back. And again, I'm just sitting down again and standing up. Sitting down, standing up. So at this point, after watching the videos, you may come to the conclusion that the differences in these monitors is not that great. So that's understandable. But if you want to proceed, we'll go to the how-to video next. So this is the parts list. Now, some of these parts I'm going to list in the description with links to go to get these parts. Some other ones I will not. I'll let you know which parts are in the description below, as some of these parts are common and you should be able to find on your own. So the first thing you're going to need is, of course, the Dell P1908FPt monitor. Now, again, if you have a different 19-inch monitor, that's fine. But in this how-to video, we're going to use the Dell P1908FPt monitor. Next, you're going to need a 2 or 4 lamp inverter board. Now, in the case of the Dell that we're using a 4 lamp inverter board, but sometimes some monitors or LCD panels only have a 2 lamps, so then you'll use a 2 lamp inverter board. But in our case, we're going to use a 4 lamp inverter board, and I'll have links to both the 2 lamp and 4 lamp inverter boards in the description. Next, you're going to need to get some CCFL lamp extension cables, and you're going to need a total of 4 of those. The one I suggest that you get is a pack of 5, and again, that link will be in the description as well. Then next you're going to need a Phillip head screwdriver, a precision screwdriver kit, and a flathead screwdriver. You'll also need some friction or electrician's tape, one or the other, and a pry bar set. Now I put this as optional because you can use, so we're using the pry bar set to open up the plastic bezel that's around the LCD panel on the monitor. Now you can use a flathead screwdriver, but the problem I ran into when trying to remove one of these, so I had two of these monitors and I removed one of them, and the plastic around the monitor was a little brittle. So when I used the flathead screwdriver, the bezel broke apart very easily. So it just broke because it was so brittle. Normally the frame around there is flexible, but in this case the bezel was a little hardened. So when I tried to use the flathead screwdriver, it broke the plastic bezel and whatnot into pieces. So that's when I decided to get the pry bar set, and I had a little bit more luck with it. So you may want to get the pry bar set to remove the bezel instead of using a flathead screwdriver. It's totally up to you, but I would suggest getting the pry bar set. But if you want to save yourself, the pry bar set that I suggest, which will also be in the description, is about $18. But if you decide you don't want that and you don't care if the bezel breaks apart or not, then you can use a flathead screwdriver to get the bezel off around the LCD panel. And finally, you'll need to get some double-sided tape. The double-sided tape is going to be used to attach to the back of the inverter board so that we can attach it to the back of the wood bezel in the Arcade 1-Up Golden Tee XL cabinet. So once you obtain all the parts on the parts list, we can begin with the how-to video. I just want to make a disclaimer here, or disclosure, that some of the footage in the how-to portion of this video was recycled from a previous video that I did. I did a previous video of the Golden Tee, how to put an IPS panel in, and I recycled some of that footage. So you'll see some things that are similar to that video if you watched it, and it's just some video parts that I didn't feel I needed to reshoot, like for example, like first taking it out of the Golden Tee cabinet, the monitor, taking that apart, and also taking off the PCB and things like that. Now the things that are relevant to this particular panel, I did reshoot, like the decasing of the monitor and putting together back the PCB and stuff. But just note that you may see some certain things, like for example towards the end when I put the panel back on the back of the Golden Tee, you'll probably notice that some of the cables don't match what you put in there, and that's because I didn't reshoot that footage. I just recycled the old footage. So keep that in mind when you're watching the how-to video. If something doesn't look exactly right, like the back of the panel with all the cables and such, once you're done, it's because I just recycled footage that I didn't feel that had to be reshot. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is decase the monitor. So get a table and put a cloth or a towel down to protect the LCD panel and put it facing down so that we can see the back of the panel. And there's 4 screws that we want to take off. Now if this is a refurbished monitor, these screws may not be there, but if they are, just take a screwdriver, whether it be a power screwdriver or a regular Phillips head screwdriver, and take those screws out. And once you get the final screw off, just set everything aside and we're ready to take the casing off this monitor. Okay, so now we're ready to take the plastic casing off the monitor. So if you look on the side here, you're going to see a little crevice here, and so we need to get a screwdriver in between there to start it. So get a tiny little flathead screwdriver, open it up, and then take a pry tool and start putting it in there and open it up gently. Now the reason I suggest using a pry tool is because on these 1908 monitors, the bezel that I'm taking off right now is a little more hardened and you can break it. Okay, so the reason I say use a pry tool, this is a previous 1908 monitor that I decased. And so this was before I got the pry tools. So what you'll see here is when I use the flathead screwdriver and tried to do it my normal way, which is, you know, open the crease and use the flathead to turn it 90 degrees to pop it off. As you can see, it broke. It broke the bezel in pieces. So whether you use the pry tool or the flathead screwdriver method, just be careful, but I think you'll have better luck using the pry tool instead of the flathead screwdriver with this particular model brand. So whether you use the pry tool or the flathead screwdriver method, either way is fine. Now when you get to the top and the bottom of the monitor, you don't necessarily have a crease. You just have to stick the pry tool in there and start popping it off, like I'm showing you here. And again, you just go all the way around the monitor until the bezel part is off. Just when you get to the bottom part where the control panel is, just make sure you're careful around that area, as there's a ribbon cable there, and you don't want to break that ribbon cable in case you want to, if you decide at some point to reuse the monitor and reassemble everything, you want that control panel intact. So once it gets popped off, just be careful, don't pull it all the way off, as there's a ribbon cable there. And then once you get that off, what we can do is we're going to flip this over. And once we flip it over, you should be able to pull the back off of the monitor to expose the back of the monitor. And then once you do that, we're going to pull out the control panel ribbon cable. So here's a zoomed in shot of the control panel ribbon cable, and on to the left of that is the connection for the side USB ports on the monitor. We do not have to pull out the USB cable. We only have to pull out the control panel cable. So all you have to do is, just looking at it this way, just pull it towards you. There's nothing holding it down. So again, just pull the ribbon cable towards you and that will unplug the ribbon cable. So again, just pull it towards you, and there you go. And now the ribbon cable will probably be glued down to the panel, so all you have to do is just lift it up to get it off the panel. So you just pull on it and lift it up, and then once you do, you can remove that front part of the bezel from the monitor. And now all we have is the monitor itself, and we remove the plastic bezel. Now we're going to remove the lamp cables. Now there's two lamp cables. There's two on the top there and two on the bottom. And as you can see here, these two on the bottom here, and they have little clips, and you have to pinch them together. But in this situation, they're hard to get out. So what we're going to do is we're going to get a little precision screwdriver and get in there to lift that clip up and pull out the lamp cables from the monitor. So this is a close-up of the lamp connectors that plug into the inverter board for the lamps. So you notice on the end of them there's like two clips. So basically when you plug those into the inverter board, they kind of snap in place and hold it in place. Now normally to remove these, again, you'd have to pinch them together to lift up that little clamp and then pull out the end, so it would pull out of the inverter board. However, because this the opening is so tight on these monitors, it's going to be hard to actually pinch the ends to pull them out. So we're going to get a precision screwdriver to kind of go in there and lift up that clamp or the clip so that we can pull out the cable without having to try to pinch the ends together to pull them out. So this is a close-up of two of the connectors still in the inverter board, and I'm going to try to show you what I'm talking about. So you see how the cables are in there, that opening is pretty tight, so you're not going to be able to just pinch the top of it down and pull it out. It's just going to be real hard to do. You can attempt it, but it's just, I have difficulties doing it. So I get a precision flathead screwdriver. And what I'm going to do is, once I get over here, I'm going to take that flathead screwdriver and get underneath the clip to lift it up so that I can pull the cable out. So as you can see here, I'm going to go in there. I'm going to just be careful not to break anything, but you shouldn't. Just get underneath that clip. And then once you get underneath it to where you can loosen it and lift the clip up, then push out and the cable will come out. And I'll go ahead and do that on the second one as well. I'm going to do it with my left hand, since it's going to be a little bit harder for me to do. But as you can see, again, you're just going to take that precision flathead screwdriver, get underneath that clip, and then lift up so you can lift up the clip. And then once you lift up the clip, the cable will come out. So I'm going to try it from the other side here, see if I have a little bit better luck doing it. And there we go, it's lifting up. And then just kind of push on your screwdriver, to yank it out. And then once you got those two out, just repeat the process on the other side to get the other two lamp cables unplugged. Alright, so now that we got the lamp cables, all four of the lamp cables unplugged, now we're going to remove the chassis. So if we put it on the side here, there's 2 screws on the left and 2 screws on the right that hold the chassis in place. So we're just going to get our Phillips head screwdriver, and we're just going to start to unscrew the screws. So we'll get one out on this side, and then we'll come to the other side and remove that screw as well. And once we get that out, we'll flip it over to the other side and get those screws out as well. Got the one on the left done, and now we'll just get the one on the right. And now the chassis should come off, but what we're going to do is we're going to set it down on the table. And what we're going to do is we're just going to push it down towards the bottom of the monitor. So again, we're just going to push it down to expose that LVDS cable, because now we're going to unplug the LVDS cable. Okay, so here's a close-up of the LVDS cable. So this is pretty simple to unplug. So you have, on the left and the right, you have 2 metal hinges on the side of the LVDS cable. So what you're going to do is you're going to pinch those, and then you're going to pull the LVDS cable towards you. Now the LVDS cable may have some glue on the bottom, so you may have to lift up on the cable a little bit to unglue it from the bottom of the LCD panel. But again, once that's done, then just pinch those 2 metal hinges together and pull it towards you, and the LVDS cable should unplug from the monitor. Okay, so I'm going to pull the chassis down a little bit more, and again, you may have to lift up the LVDS cable because it may be glued down a little bit. And then once you do, just pinch the sides and pull it out, and that's pretty much it. Again, just make sure that it's unplugged, and once it's unplugged, then push the lamp cables through those holes and take off the chassis, and that's it. The LCD panel is exposed and you've decased the monitor. And now with that done, we can go ahead and get the stock monitor out of the Golden Tee XL cabinet. Okay, so now we're ready to take the monitor out of the Golden Tee XL cabinet. So the first thing we're going to do is go to the back and take off the top panel, which is held by 5 screws. You may have less screws, but I use 5. So I'm just going to use a Phillips head screwdriver to unscrew the screws and get this panel off. And once you get the final screw off, go ahead and take the panel off to expose the back of the LCD monitor and the PCB. Next, we're going to go ahead and unplug some of the cables from the PCB. So the first one we're going to undo is the Wi-Fi. So we're just going to unscrew that off. And once we get that unscrewed off, we'll go ahead and unplug the marquee, unplug the speaker cable, and then finally unplug the power. So now we're going to move to the front of the machine and we're going to remove the control panel. So there are 4 screws on the control panel and we're just going to use our Phillips head screwdriver to loosen those screws. And once all 4 screws are loosened, go ahead and take all 4 of the screws and set them aside for now. And now we can go ahead and remove the control panel. Just lift it up. It may be a little tight, so be careful. And we need to unplug 3 cables from the back of the control panel that are attached. So the first cable we want to remove is that black cable. I'm not sure what that cable is for, but we need to remove that. Then go ahead and remove the ribbon cable, and then we want to unplug the ground cable for the trackball. And once you get that unplugged, go ahead and set the control panel aside. Okay, so now we can remove the plexiglass bezel. And there's 10 screws all together, 4 on the bottom, 4 on the top, and 2 on in the middle. Now what I usually do is I start with the bottom 4 screws, then take the top screws out, and then finally take the 2 middle screws out. So I'm just going to use my electric screwdriver here. If you're worried about damaging your bezel, you may want to use a manual, a regular screwdriver. But in this case, I'm just going to unscrew the screws for the bottom and the top. And so once we get the top and the bottom screws out, then we can remove the 2 middle screws. So when you remove the screws from the middle, you may want to put your hand on the bezel to make sure it doesn't slip out. It should not slip out. It's in there pretty tight, but just in case, you may want to put your hand on there once you get that final screw unscrewed. And once that's taken out, just kind of lift up on the bezel and then pull down, and then set aside the bezel and just make sure you set it aside to where it doesn't get scratched up or anything like that, because you want to try to prevent it getting scratched up when you put it back in. So now we can take the monitor or LCD panel out of the Arcade 1-Up cabinet. So there are 8 screws total that hold the panel in place, 4 on the left, 4 on the right. So we're just going to take our Phillips head screwdriver and take those screws out. Now, if this is the first time taking the panel out, you may have tape going around the monitor. That's what's called friction tape. Go ahead and just peel that tape off so that you can remove the monitor once we get the screws out of the cabinet. And then once you get the final screw out, we're ready to take the panel out. It should just come out. So what we'll do is take our hand and go to the back of it and kind of push on it a little bit, and the panel should just pop out. And you'll have a bunch of cables hooked up to it, but that's the panel and that's it. So now we can take this over to our workbench or table and take the LCD panel out. So on your workbench or table, you may want to put a towel or a blanket to set the LCD panel down so it doesn't get scratched. But once you get settled on how you want to do that, we're going to take the panel and we're going to remove the PCB. Okay, so there are 6 screws that hold the PCB in place. 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, and 2 on the side. So we're going to take our Phillips head screwdriver and we're going to remove those screws. Now, one thing you may notice, you notice the ground cable for the trackball that's right below the PCB with the blue end on there. Now, when I took this apart, I didn't take a picture where all the cables were, so that ground cable may be in a different location than what it shows on here. So just keep that in mind. That's just because when I took it apart, I didn't take a picture of where all the wires were. So, but as long as it's ground to the panel, that's all that matters. So I just want to make you aware that your ground cable for the trackball may be in a different place. But at any rate, we're going to go ahead and remove all the screws from the PCB plate, and then we can take the PCB off. And once we get the final screw off, then we can turn the PCB around to take the cables off. So we're just going to flip it around carefully. And the 2 cables we're going to remove are the inverter board power cable and the LVDS cable. So if you look at the LVDS connector, you'll notice that there are two red wires on the left. And there's also a white dot on the LVDS connector that's obscured by the yellow cable there. This indicates that that is the side where the power pin is, or it's pin 1. Just remember, just make note of this, because you have to make sure that when we plug this back in, that it's plugged in correctly. Now in this orientation, if you're looking at the top of the PCB, the LVDS cable, the red cables would face to the left. So just remember that, because if you don't, what will happen is if you put it reverse, you may damage your PCB or your monitor or both. So now the video is going to show you how to do it anyway, but just as a note, if you do this in the future and don't watch this video, you have to make note of what pin 1 is, because if you plug it in wrong, you'll do damage to your PCB or monitor or both. So once you confirm the orientation of where pin 1 is on the LVDS cable and on the PCB, you can go ahead and unplug the inverter board, power cable, and the LVDS cable. Now we just need to remove the screw for the LVDS ground cable. You can leave the ground cable for the trackball intact. You don't have to remove that. Again, how my setup was, I've removed this so many times, I forgot where Arcade 1Up put the trackball ground cable. So if it's actually sharing the same screw for the LVDS ground cable, then you'll have to remove both. But if not, you can just leave the trackball ground cable there. And then once we remove that screw for the LVDS ground, we can move on. Okay, so now we're ready to remove the LCD panel from the casing. So there are 4 screws total, 2 on the left, 2 on the right, that we have to remove. So we just want to get a precision screwdriver to unscrew those screws. Now you'll see on the right there that there's a label, and that label will cover one of the screw holes, so you just have to remove some of the sticker there so that you can unscrew it. But once you get your precision screwdriver, just go ahead and take it, and we're going to remove both of these screws. So once we do that, then we'll flip it over to the other side and remove those screws as well. And once we get the final screw out, carefully pull on the LCD panel to take it apart. Don't pull it on too hard. Now, as I said before, I've taken this apart multiple times, so you're going to have probably cables are going to be taped. So you'll have to remove the tape on the cables. But go ahead and push in the LVDS cable and push in the inverter power cable through that hole, and then start taking it apart. And again, you're going to have a bunch of tape, probably taping, that have all the cables taped, so you'll have to remove the tape and all that as well. So that's what it looks like when we're starting to take it apart. And the next step is going to be able to take off this power cable that connects to the monitor. So this is a picture, a close-up picture of the power cable that plugs in the back of the monitor. Just pull on the cable and the connector should come out of the socket easily. So just pull on the power cable and it will come loose. So now when we got that unplugged, we can go ahead and unplug the LVDS cable that's on the back of the monitor. So this is a zoomed in picture of the LVDS connector that's plugged in the monitor. Now to unplug this, you'll notice that there are 2 little metal clips on the left and the right of the connector. So what you're going to do is you're going to pinch those 2 together and then pull out, and that will get the LVDS cable out of the monitor. So this is the back of the panel. So again, we're just going to take our fingers, pinch those 2 metal clips together, and pull out. Just like that, and it pulls out. And now we're going to set that aside because we're going to use that again. And now we're going to set aside the old panel and put in the new panel. Okay, so now we're ready to put the new LCD panel in the casing. So on the left is the Arcade 1Up stock casing, and on the right is the panel we pulled from the 1908 FPT monitor. So the first thing we want to do is we want to tape these cables down. so that they don't get in the way and so that we don't pinch any of the cables when we put the panel in. So grab your friction tape or your electrician's tape, whichever you decided to get, and let's just go ahead and tape these cables down. Now this is the inverter board, that's the stock arcade one-up inverter board. We're just going to keep that in there just so that we know where it is in case you want to swap it back out. But we're going to tape it down so the cable doesn't get in the way, because we're not going to use this inverter board, but again we're just going to keep it in there just so you know where it's at in case you want to replace the panel. And do the same thing for the power cable for the monitor that goes from the inverter board to the monitor in the stock arcade one-up LCD panel. Just tape that down so that it's out of the way. So next we need to add extension cables to the existing lamp cables because they're going to be too short. So essentially the inverter board's going to go on the outside of the casing, so we need to add these extension cables to the existing lamp cables so they have enough length so that we can put the inverter board on the outside of the casing. So they only plug in one way, so don't force it in, just snap them in place. And you see I just did the top lamp cables, and now we'll go ahead and plug in the bottom cables. And once you get them all plugged in, what we're going to do is on the two top ones, I'm going to tape them together. This is just going to indicate that the ones that are taped are the top lamp cables, and then the ones that aren't taped are the bottom lamp cables. And this is going to be important for when we plug them into the inverter board, because both of the top and both of the bottom have to be plugged into the same side of the inverter board, and you'll see what I'm talking about once we get to that point. So now that we got our cables in there, now we're going to put in the LVDS cable into the monitor. So this is a close-up of the LVDS connector and the female connector on the actual LCD panel. So when you plug this in, you just want to line up the male connector to the female connector and push in, and it should snap into place. You don't need to pinch the two metal clips for this. Again, you just line it up and push it in, and it should snap into place. And just after you put it in, just kind of pull on it a little to make sure that it is secure. And when you do plug in the cable, make sure the pins are showing and they're facing you on the top when you plug it in. Do not plug it in like the one on the right with the metal plate facing up, because that's the wrong way. And one, it won't go in and it won't click in, and two, if you do happen to get it plugged in that way, you're going to screw up your more likely you're going to screw up your LCD panel. So make sure, as shown on the image to the left, make sure when you plug it in that the pins are showing on the top and not the metal plate. And also note that if you're doing a different panel other than the 1908 FPT, that the LVDS cable may plug in with the metal part up. It just depends on the model LCD panel that you're using. In most cases, it's the pins showing, and that's the top that you plug in, but sometimes it's the other way. So you just have to be cautious on when you unplug it, kind of note what side the red cables are, which are the power cables, if they're pointing to the left or if they're on the right, and that's how you plug in the LVDS cable on different monitors. But on this LCD panel, this is the way you plug it up. So once you have the cable in the right orientation with the pins facing up, just go ahead and slide that in there. And like I said, once you get it in there, it should just snap in. There it is. Give it a little tug to make sure it's tight. And now we're ready to put this into the casing. So what I like to do is I like to put the casing on the left and the panel on the right and work it from it that way. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to run these lamp cables through the hole, because again the inverter board is going to be on the outside of the panel, so we want to slide those through the hole. And then we also then want to take start folding it together, and then the LVDS cable, and we want to slide that through that hole as well. Make sure we get that through, and also the ground cable that's attached to it. And then once we do that, we can just carefully start putting it together and just pull on the lamp cables to get all the slack out. And then once you pull on them, get little to get the slack out, then we can sandwich these together. So just lightly kind of press it together, and as you can see, we're going to line up those screw holes so to get the screws in there. So I'm grabbing my screws for this, and then once we get the screws on there, you can see the two holes right there. And we kind of shake it a little bit towards me to use gravity to pull the monitor towards the screw holes so they line up. And then once you get them lined up, you just take your screws and screw them back in place. So like I'm doing here, just getting it lined up. And sometimes it's a little difficult. It takes a little bit of time to get them lined up. But once you do, grab your screwdriver and screw it down. And once you get that screw down, we'll do the other screw as well. Okay, now once we get that second screw screwed in, we're just going to turn it around to the other side and do the same thing. Just kind of shake the monitor toward you to use gravity to get the holes lined up, and put your next screw in, and we're going to screw that down and do the same thing for the last screw. And once we get that final screw in there, that's it. The panel is in there, and we're ready to put the PCB back on the back of the monitor. Now before we put the PCB back on, I just wanted to show you this because some people may think that this is a concern, particularly when they put the plexiglass bezel back on with the screen in. You'll notice that the frame and the casing don't line up. You'll notice that the LCD panel extends about 1/8 of an inch out from the panel. This is fine. Again, I only note it because some people may have concern when they put the plexiglass back on, like it may damage it or something. I've gone ahead and done this and put it in there, and there's really no issue with it. The plexiglass graphic around there still covers up the sides of the panel just fine. It doesn't really buckle or anything like that. So I just wanted to make sure that anyone who does this video and notices, oh my god, it's coming out like about 1/8 of an inch, is that going to damage my panel? In my opinion, it's not. And again, I've already put the panel on here with the plexiglass back on with this panel in there, and it doesn't harm it. But again, if it's something that concerns you, then of course you may want to stop doing the project, but it's not going to do any damage to your plexiglass. So with that said, we'll go ahead and put the PCB back on the back of the panel. Okay, so now we're ready to put the PCB back onto the back of the panel. So the first thing we want to do is we want to secure down the LVDS ground cable. So get our screw, line it up with the hole that it needs to go into, and take our Phillips head screwdriver and screw that down. Okay, so once we get the ground cable secure, now we're going to plug in the inverter cable, power cable, and the LVDS cable back into the PCB. Now I just showed you the inverter board and the cable, so right now we're just going to plug in the cable, and then we're going to plug in the LVDS cable. Make sure that it's plugged in correctly. The power cable should be going to the left of the inverter board connector. Don't put it in the wrong way. And once we get it plugged in, make sure it's secured down. And we got those two cables plugged in. Okay, now we're going to get our lamp cables and our inverter board cable, power cable, and we're going to put them facing down towards the monitor, just like the ribbon cable and the headphone jack cable, which is what I believe that black cable is. So once we get it all lined up like this, we're going to flip the PCB back up, and we're just going to, for right now, we're just going to screw in the top 2 screws. So what we're going to do is grab one of our screws, put it in place, and screw it down. And we're going to do that for the second top screw as well. So once we get the 2 top screws screwed in, we're going to organize these cables a little bit. So I'm going to tape the 2 top cables, as you can see where we taped them together. I'm going to take those 2 lamp cables and tape it to the headphone cable. Just kind of tape them together so that they're a little bit more organized. So again, I'm just going to put them together and put some tape around there, just so that 1, to organize it a little better, and 2, to keep them together so they're not going all over the place. Then I'm going to do the same thing with the other 2 lamp cables and the inverter board cable. I'm just going to get those and just kind of tape those together as well, so that again it's a little bit more organized and the cables aren't really like going all over the place. So then I'm just going to tape it, and then once it's taped, kind of push it down, get the ribbon cable there, and then we're going to screw the 2 side screws. So once we get that pushed down, line up the screw holes on the left and right side, and we're going to screw those screws in. So we'll do the left one, and then we'll go ahead and screw in the right one. Okay, so now that we got the right screw put in, now we're going to screw in the bottom screws. Now when we screw in the bottom screws, we don't want to screw them all the way in tightly because it's going to crimp the cables. So we just want to screw it in enough to where the screw is secure and the panel is secure without it popping out. So just kind of eyeball it and kind of make your best judgment. But again, you don't want to screw it all the way down. You just want to give it a few turns just to make sure the screw stays in, and also that it keeps the panel in place. Gives you like a little gap there. And do the same thing with the other screw when you screw that in. And again, just screw it in enough to secure it. You don't have to screw it all the way down because again, we don't want to crimp the cables. And once that's in place, that's pretty much it. We're just going to connect. Now we're going to connect the inverter board and the lamp cables. So remember the two cables that we taped together. Those are the top cables. We just need to make sure that those both go on one side. So again, it just plugs into one side of the inverter board. It only plugs in one way, so don't force it in. It should just slip in and pop in. And then we want to plug in the other 2 that we didn't tape together and plug those in to the other side. And again, don't force it in. It should just click in. And finally, we can plug in the power to the inverter board. And we've got it plugged in. Okay, and now we want to add our double-sided tape to the back of the inverter board. This is going to be used to attach it to the back of the wood bezel once we get the monitor back in. So I just use this particular double-sided tape, put 2 strips on there for now, get it prepared. And once we get the double-sided tape on there, that's it. We're ready to put the monitor in the cabinet, but first we're going to test it to make sure everything works properly. Okay, so now we're going to test the new LCD panel before we put it back in the cabinet, just to make sure that everything works okay. Now after you do the test, if something's not working or something's out of the ordinary, you'll have to go back to the previous steps and kind of figure out what you did wrong. So we're just going to go ahead and turn this on. And as you can see, it looks like everything's going to work okay. Make sure it does load. And it seems to be working. So now that we've confirmed that it works, we can go ahead and put this back into the cabinet. Okay, now we're ready to put the monitor back into the cabinet. So we're just going to take everything, take all our cables, go ahead and slide that in. And once we slide it in, it should just pop in. And there we go. Now we can go ahead and grab our 8 screws. And I'm sorry about the focus issue. I think it has to do with the that light that's there that's causing the focus issues. But at any rate, we're going to take our 8 screws that we originally took out, and we're just going to put them back in. So just start at the bottom, take your Phillips head screwdriver or power screwdriver, and screw those screws back in. And once we get the final screw put in, we're ready to put the plexiglass back on. Before that, you may want to clean the LCD screen, but after you clean it, go ahead and we're ready to put the plexiglass back on. Okay, so now we're ready to put the bezel back on. If you have some Novus 1, you may want to spray that on there and clean off the screen before you do it, to make sure there's not any dust, and use a microfilter cloth to clean it off. Now, you may not want to use an electric screwdriver if that's what you've been using to screw this back on. What happened when I did that, it chipped some of the bezel off the back, so I had to use a black magic marker to color it in. But you may want to just use a regular screwdriver to put the bezel back in, like I'm going to show you now. So essentially, you're going to take the bezel, you're kind of slide it right there, kind of put it on there, and then slide up, flatten it out, and slide it up a little bit so it just goes into place. And what I usually do is I put the 2 middle screws in first. That way it secures it in place, and then I'll screw in the top and the bottom. And I apologize for the camera going focusing in and out. But just go ahead and screw the 2 middle screws there. Do the first one. And then once it's in place, you can let go of the bezel and screw in the other middle one. And then once you get that in there, then we can screw in the screws on the bottom and on the top of the bezel. So as you can see, I'm putting the final screw in, but if you look, you can see some of the metal frame showing on the top because of the angle of the camera. Again, that's why you may want to put friction tape around there so that that shows up as black. But once you get everything done, that's it. The bezel's in, and now we can move on to the next step. Okay, so now we're ready to put the control panel back in place. So grab your control panel, and we're gonna actually get these cables. We're gonna do one at a time. I know I'm grabbing all 3, but we're actually gonna do one at a time. So position your control panel to a point where you can plug in all the cables. I'm trying to get it to where I can show it on the camera what I'm doing. The first cable that you're going to want to plug in is your trackball ground cable. It actually doesn't matter what order you do this in. This was the order I did it in. So plug in your trackball ground cable. And then the next thing I plugged in was the black cable. Again, I'm not sure what this is for, but I plugged that in. And then finally plugged in the gray ribbon cable into the control panel. And once we get that plugged in, we can go ahead and put the control panel back into the cabinet. So when we finally get it plugged in, go ahead and flip it around. And then go ahead and reseat the control panel back in there. And we'll go ahead and grab our 4 screws to go ahead and screw it back down. So once you grab your screws, go ahead and put them in the screw holes. Make sure they line up. If they don't line up, take the control panel out and put it back in to make sure it does line up, like I'm doing right there. It didn't line up properly, so I had to take it back out again and kind of make sure everything lined up right. Once I did that, then I put the screws back in, And once you get them all back in, then we're just going to take our Phillips head screwdriver and screw them down. I'm using the electric screwdriver. Just make sure if you're using an electric screwdriver not to go down too hard, or else you'll crack the acrylic or plexiglass. So we're just going to go ahead and screw those down. And once we get those screwed down, the control panel's in place, and we'll move to the back of the monitor to plug everything back up into the PCB. Okay, now we're at the back of the cabinet and we're going to start plugging back in the cables. So we're going to start with reattaching the Wi-Fi cable. So we're going to attach that and screw it on. And once we get that screwed on, then we'll go ahead and replace the marquee power cable. Plug that in. Plug in the speaker cable. And then finally, we'll go ahead and plug in the power cable. So now we got all that plugged in. So now we want to get the inverter board connected to the back of the wood panel. So what we're going to do now is we're going to attach it there. So what we want to do is peel off the back of the double-sided tape we put on there earlier. So we're just going to peel those off. And peel off the second strip as well. And once we peel that off, then we're just going to take that inverter board and stick it to the back of the wood bezel there. So we're just going to take it and stick it on there. And when you stick it on there, make sure the lamp cables aren't in the way when you stick it on the back. And just push on it a little bit firmly to make sure it goes in place. And that's it. And we're ready to test this one more time before we seal it up. So before we put the top back panel back on, we're going to do one final test to make sure everything is functional. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the light to take the glare off the screen, and as you can see, it is turned on and everything seems to be booting up. So we can go ahead and turn this off and put the top back panel back on to the back of the cabinet. So now we're going to put the back panel back on. So we're just going to put that back on there. We got our 5 screws. And we're going to go ahead and put those all back in place. We can take our power screwdriver and screw them all in. And we're going to get that final screw in. And that's it. Your cabinet's ready. You can put it back where it should be and you're ready to play. So that concludes this modification. You've successfully upgraded your stock Arcade 1-Up LCD panel with a different 19-inch LCD panel. This one from a Dell 1908FPt monitor. Although an IPS panel does look the best, theoretically you can replace the stock Arcade 1-Up LCD panel with any 19-inch panel from a monitor as long as it has a resolution of 1280 by 1024. However, most older monitors do not use LED lights and instead use CCFL lamps. So a third-party inverter board is needed to power the lamps. Although it is not as bright as the stock Arcade 1-Up LCD panel, the video is not as distorted when sitting or viewing at an angle. At least that is my opinion. You may think the Arcade 1-Up panel is fine the way it is, and that is fine. The stock Arcade 1-Up panel works and it is playable. However, for those who believe the panel is not that good and do not have an IPS panel on hand, but have an older 19-inch monitor lying around, this may be a good way to replace the LCD panel. It's always good to have options. So with that, thanks for watching and see you at the next video.
Call for 1, trying for power.